Hello, and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. March, as many of our listeners know, is Women's History Month. This often features discussions that focus on the role of women in a variety of areas, and in the security field, we see the celebration of women pioneers in the general officer ranks. We see the celebration of women in roles during World War II. But it seems like we see the same memes over and over again each year as the month repeats itself. We're joined today by two rising scholars of gender and conflict who will give us a broader perspective on the issues surrounding women in the field of security. And I'll ask them to introduce themselves now. Hilary, why don't we start with you?
Hi, thanks so much for having us here, Doyle. It's been a real pleasure to work with you on this. My name is Hilary Matfess, and I'm currently a Ph.D. candidate at Yale University. Beginning in fall 2021, I'll be starting as an assistant professor at the Corbell School at the University of Denver. My research broadly intersects with issues on gender, security, and African politics, and my first book, Women in the War on Boko Haram, was published in 2017.
And congratulations on the job at Corbell. That's really exciting, and it's really impressive, the group of folks they're assembling out there. Rob, why don't you introduce yourself for us?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. Really excited to be here as well. My name is Robert Nagel. My wife insists on the German pronunciation, so I am German. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown University at the Institute for Women, Peace and Security. I did my Ph.D. at the University of Kent in the UK. And my work broadly focuses on the gendered influences on conflict resolution. So I look at negotiation, mediation, and peacekeeping as well. And I'm very excited to be here and talk about lots of different things with you.
Excellent. And some of our listeners may recognize Hilary's name from the roundtable that we ran in October on the role of gender in conflict. And I would have to give Hilary an enormous amount of credit because she was instrumental in assembling the extraordinary team of scholars that brought just a really fascinating diversity of perspectives and insights into the issue. And I really appreciate the energy that you put into that. It was, I think, a tremendous result. So recently, there was a contretemps that people would have followed on Twitter and social media when a Fox News personality, whose name I won't bother to mention, criticized U.S. military efforts to incorporate gender equality as a sign of wokeness. And I'm wondering, especially in the work that you do on gender and conflict as it relates to rebel, insurgent, and terrorist groups, does this criticism reflect their experience? Are these groups far more woke than we're aware? Or are there potentially other explanations for the incorporation of women in conflict settings?
That nameless Fox News commentator has been a thorn in my side for decades. And growing up in a very conservative area of Georgia, he has many accolades there. And so I kind of just want to reframe your question to push it away from, frankly, his incendiary and off-base framing about wokeness and chat just a little bit more about what security gaps emerge when you leave women out of our security forces. For many years, I worked primarily on Boko Haram. Boko Haram is primarily known for the Chibok abductions. But in addition to that, Boko Haram has used more female suicide bombers than any other rebel group that we've been able to keep track of. And so in reports with Jason Warner and Alan Chapin, I've unpacked this dynamic. But the Nigerian military's lack of women in its ranks made it really difficult for them to respond to female suicide bombers, in part because they just didn't have anyone who could search women. And this is it's a dynamic that repeats itself time and time again. The lack of women in national military forces makes it very difficult for them to do their job. And so framing this as an issue of wokeness rather than just an efficiency issue, I think is a way that conservative forces really undermine the fact that you need to have diverse teams to have effective teams. And that's all the more true in the security space.
Yeah, and also, this framing of wokeness sort of neglects the history we know there is in terms of women's participation in armed groups, in national militaries. In your introduction, you mentioned women's participation in World War II, but even going back centuries, right? The Dahomey Women's Corps, right, which were the template for the King's Guard in Black Panther, right? A real life women's corps. And so framing it around wokeness, right, disparages that history of women fulfilling these combat roles, right? As Hilary mentioned, in terms of effectiveness, one of the key points that the UN likes to make about women's participation in peacekeeping operations is their contribution in terms of body searches, their ability to engage with all members of the community, especially in societies that are more patriarchal, where men, foreign men in particular, are not allowed to speak to local women. Having women as part of the patrols, as part of the engagement teams, is crucial to making sure you get to talk to everyone, you get information from everyone, and you are prepared for all threats, right? And that connects back to the example Hilary gave about Boko Haram, right? If you're not talking to everyone, you're not seeing all the threats.
Additionally, in studying for my dissertation, I was cataloging women's non-combat contributions to rebel groups. And it was actually a lot of fun. And I think very few people will describe their dissertation research as necessarily fun, especially when it's desk-based. But one of the things that stood out to me was just all of the complementary tasks that women were able to do that men just couldn't, right? But I read this fascinating account of how they used female sanitary products to carry clandestine messages across borders. That's something that men can't do. Similarly, my conversations with female veterans of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which was a rebel group that became a political party that appears to now be a rebel group again. But these women were discussing in the fight in the 1970s, they would have to bare their breasts to peasants to prove that they were women before they'd be allowed to go into the homes to engage in this political education, this community outreach that the TPLF absolutely needed in order to be an effective insurgency. And it was in proving that they were women, in demonstrating kind of that shared gender identity, that women were able to gain access to do this. And I certainly don't think that, rebel groups are necessarily woke. It's just that they're seeking to, exploit the opportunities that they have at their disposal when they often lack, conventional military means or resources.
So that leads into another interesting question. And oftentimes when we look at insurgent, rebel, terrorist groups that incorporate women fighters, they exist and operate in societies that afford women relatively little autonomy in social settings. And I'm curious if we have an explanation, if it's purely an efficacy explanation, or if there are other things that account for the increased role and autonomy of women in conflict in these settings, in these societies.
I think there are two aspects to this. One, and it depends on the socio-political and cultural context in which the group operates, right? So in Latin America, we've seen a lot of leftist groups that had a more socialist ideology in the 70s and 80s, incorporate a lot of women because they actually had sort of the egalitarian ideology of we're equal, we're all participating in this cultural revolution, right? And so the resistance to the patriarchal norms was a key driver of women's participation. And in other contexts, and Hilary can speak to this better based on her work on Boko Haram, it actually drives off traditional norms, right? And I'll let Hilary speak to that.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we can see armed groups both institutionalize and sort of reify traditional gender norms and traditional relationships between men and women. And in some instances, they sort of upend them or subvert them. And so it's a really interesting sort of dichotomy. And there's a lot of new work on things like gender ideologies and how they differ between armed groups and even armed groups with a similar ideology. But one of the things that strikes me is the work on women's participation in rebel groups has, emphasized the role that ideology plays. So work by Thomas Reedwood, between Reedwood and Jacana Thomas, has emphasized leftist groups are more likely to incorporate women in combat roles. But women's participation, isn't absent from rebel groups, even when they're incorporating them into kind of complementary or auxiliary roles. So again, as a part of my dissertation research, I was trying to document women's non-combat participation to rebel groups. And one of the things that I was finding was that, Islamist, nationalist, leftist groups without any discernible ideology, significant proportions of each of these categories are relying on women within their ranks. And so in some instances, we see this appeal to women, this recruitment strategy that says, like, if you join, you can upend social norms. You can, prove yourself equal to men. And that was a narrative that really surrounded recruitment into groups like the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. Women told me we were fighting even more than the men because we were fighting not just the Derg, this military dictatorship they were trying to overthrow, but we were also fighting society. In contrast, in some groups, women's roles are sort of explicitly auxiliary or complementary to men's. And Robin, my good friend, Phoebe Donnelly, has looked at how rebel groups will use marriage and the reproduction of the family unit within the armed group in order to both, benefit from all of the gains that women's participation can give them, as well as to cultivate loyalty to the group through that gender identity of family relations, in which the women's often complementary and subordinate.
So it's interesting, when you talk about this question of inclusion, we're focused here at the tactical and operational level when we talk about the inclusion of women in armed groups. And yet at the policy level, there's also a similar echo of this. And Bethany McGann touched on this really well in her TNSR roundtable essay about this idea that the so-called Women, Peace, and Security agenda, which is forwarded at the United Nations, focuses mostly upon inclusion. And the phrase that she used, which I just found enormously evocative, was the idea of a pink ghetto, that somehow you had solved an issue by sufficient representation, and that in doing this, you would somehow temper the potential violence or the issues associated with it. And I'm curious as to your perspective on these questions, not only within the groups themselves, but also at the policy level in dealing with it.
I would start with distinguishing between sort of the women, peace, and security agenda as it relates to women versus gender, right? Because what we've talked a lot about is is women's participation in armed groups. And what we haven't talked about yet is how these armed groups are gendered institutions, meaning they're nominally predominantly male, right? And substantively masculine, right? As in certain characteristics and traits are valued more than others. And they are, because we're talking about armed institutions, associated with brutality and violence. And these become connected to the ideas of masculinity. And so what we see is that in armed groups in particular, women's participation is often contingent on them emulating masculine traits and masculine behaviors. And Derek K. Cohn and Laura Sjoberg, for example, have done really great work showing that because women want to fit into these groups, they often participate even in explicitly gendered violence, such as wartime rape, in becoming part of the group, adopting these masculine traits, and showing within the hierarchy of the group, I'm just like you. Right? Demonstrating to the men, I am just like you. I can be just as brutal, just as violent, and you can trust and rely on me in combat, right? Because I've demonstrated how brutal I can be. And so this substantive gendering, right, where we don't look at the bodies, right, female or male, but look at the traits and behaviors that people exhibit, right, the social constructs, then I think we should reconsider the question of, does WPS, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, automatically mean more peaceful?
To that point, one of the things that really struck me, both in the course of my dissertation research and in the project that actually connected Bethany and I, which was a report I wrote for the United States Institute of Peace on women in community-based armed groups, it's just this point that women's interests might not be aligned with peace. It's actually a really narrow interpretation of what constitutes women's interests. in a number of cases, we have women voluntarily contributing to non-state armed groups. And even if they're not, taking up arms or doing it in a way that we really interpret with like support, women can, vocalize their support for violence, can encourage other members of their family to join these groups. Another thing that like the current women, peace, and security discourse does by the creation of that pink ghetto is like renders totally one-dimensional this idea of like women's interests. And so Marie Berry and Millie Lake have some really great work examining how different women benefit differently after war. And if you think just about, like women as a homogenous block, then how do you see the differences between Hutu and Tutsi women in post-genocide Rwanda? How do we understand how things like racial, religious, ethnic, class identities all shape how women navigate the post-conflict space? If you're trying to design a policy based on like a representation of women's interests that paints us all as like angels who are holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and totally befuddled by how conflict broke out, you're going to make really bad policy.
I was kind of hoping you'd be able to share with us the second verse to Kumbaya.
Well, I think both of you know me well enough to know that I am like a living representation of like women can be very bad and very brutal. Like it drives me crazy. And in part because like if we sell women's participation on the basis of like, God, women are just angels, like the international policy world's equivalent of like, oh, my mom, she's just the best. She's like the kindest, most gentle person. Like, if only the world were run by moms. Like, that's like crap policy. And also, if we sell women's participation based on this idea that they're not going to act according to incentives, they're going to act according to some internal, like maternal compass that leads directly towards peace, what happens when that inevitably does not manifest? Does that mean like we go back to like, well, we tried, they were just too gentle? Like, no, there has to be a better justification.
And just to add to that, it also, because it's all relational, right? If we paint women in that angelic, peaceful role, by default, the contrast is violent men. And speaking as a man myself, I find that offensive, right? That the assumption is that I am more inclined to violence than I am to peace. So we often don't think about the reverse. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that.
Yeah. And, I think that is a natural lead into the next question is, acute listeners will have realized by now from the voices that we're having a discussion about gender and conflict that includes two men and one woman. And it seems that discussions and discourse about gender and conflict navigate between sort of a Scylla and Charybdis, one that the discussion becomes ghettoized as a women's issue, and that if the majority or plurality of discussants aren't women, that you are somehow not appropriately dealing with the issue. The other being that there is a risk when you speak from the perspective of someone who hasn't had the experience of living as a woman within the contexts and societies in question, that you may speak presumptively in a way that doesn't sufficiently credit the lived experience and issues that are confronted. And I'm curious from each of you, as scholars addressing this from different backgrounds, one as a man, one as a woman, how do you deal with these challenges?
I'll go first. It's a tough line to walk. And your question makes me think back to when I was a research analyst at the National Defense University. I used to give one of the lectures to our like professional military education courses on West Africa. And I would like inevitably get some like well-meaning mid-ranking military officer who would say, like noticing that I am female, like point out like, how do we help the women in these terrible contexts? And I would point out that like, the disproportionate burden of like household care on displaced women and the lack of like availability of menstrual products and dignity kits was a significant burden on women that subjected them to an even greater vulnerability, even, once they had fled villages that were under attack and were living in government-run IDP camps. And the full body cringe that would like ripple through the auditorium of largely male military officers as I brought up the fact that menstruation occurs just underlined to me, like, oh man, like men need to care about women's issues. And it just has to be normalized as a part of the conversation. I don't want to like exaggerate or like give into the cult of the infantry, right? But like these are ostensibly men whose professional lives are designed around the waging of wars, but it's menstrual blood that makes them squeamish. Yikes. That's like not great. And if you're that squeamish and unwilling to engage with that basic of a women's issue, then the more complex ones just aren't going to be possible. I think getting men to pay attention to women's issues is really critical. I mean, both from the fact that like they can't do their jobs if they don't, and also from the basis of men, and largely white men, still dominate security institutions. And if we're not making an effort to grab their ear and say, like, this matters and you're going to be bad at your job if you don't pay attention to it, then all we're ever going to be doing is like presenting the same, findings or same approaches to rooms full of people who already value them.
Speaking from my perspective, as you said, and as I previously already mentioned, speaking as a man, and not just a man, but a white man, my positionality is hugely important to how I approach these questions that I study. It also usually leads to me being a minority in the room, because most scholars, most experts that work on these issues are often women. And I find that really fascinating and actually really enjoyable, because I found working in these spaces very collaborative and positive, and have really enjoyed it. What I find so fascinating is that men continue to treat gender sort of not all men, but a lot of men treat gender and women as synonymous. So by default, treat themselves as genderless beings. So only by including women, they become aware of gendered dimensions, right? And so their own masculinity goes unquestioned. And that's where I think working as a man on gender issues, I can add to the conversation without crowding out other voices. So that's one part. And the other is that in my work, I try to highlight those who came before me, right? And listen and to those whose lived experience I talk about, and the experts that have worked on this. So that's how I try to place myself.
Yeah, I can't agree with you enough about the importance of masculinity studies. It's funny to me how there seems to be a double standard when we talk about like recruitment into non-state armed groups, where even women who take up arms, even women who serve as combatants, a lot of the policy community will greet them with like, oh, but did they want to? Oh, did they follow a boy there? Like they probably got brainwashed. But even when greeted with, male child soldiers, it's like, well, they are a legitimate combatant and like they obviously want to be there. And in taking a gendered approach, and gender not being synonymous with women, but relating to, gender roles, gender norms, the relationship between men and women, allows us to actually be like a little bit kinder and a little more understanding, a little more empathetic and analytically rigorous when we think about like men's participation in these groups. Additionally, like understanding what it means to be a man and why contributing to a non-state armed group might help you achieve that is actually like really important for understanding how these non-state armed groups continue to operate. Neither here nor there, but like one of the most fascinating conversations I've had in my life has been just like asking random men in my life what it means to be a man. And then you see how people will like connect that concept of selfhood, of the actualization of being a man, with their behaviors and their attitudes and how they live their lives. And it was that approach that like inspired some of my work with Hilary Hudson about how bride price, which is often a prerequisite for getting married, and the economic difficulties that so many young men faced, had spurred recruitment into non-state armed groups in South Sudan and Nigeria.
And to broaden it out just a little bit, thinking about gender is so important because it, as Hilary just said, makes for better analysis, and it highlights things. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration at the last minute pulled an airstrike in Syria, reportedly because a woman and children were in the strike zone. So this brings up two points. One, Cynthia Enlow's women and children, right, where we infantilize women by juxtapositioning them with children. And secondly, we're all men in the strike zone combatants, right? So the gendering that happens there, that we treat military-aged males as automatic combatants. Right, and there were reports about this coming out of Afghanistan a few years ago as well. And if we don't pay attention to gender, we're missing out on these aspects. And there's my own research on mediation onset really speaks to that sort of women and children and the need to protect them that we saw play out there when the Biden administration pulled the strike.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, as you were saying that, it strikes me that oftentimes in conflict situations, there's a willingness to be extraordinarily elastic in the presumption of innocence that comes with age, but that the social norms that bring that same presumption with gender identity are far harder to overcome. And I think you're right that the evidence would suggest exactly the opposite. That in fact, when you have instances of very young fighters, that they are often doing it without something that can be recognized as consent, and that there's little evidence that the majority of women fighters are not acting of their own volition.
One more point on that, like we've discussed how this notion of like the protection of women and the infantilization of women can mean the withholding of violence. But I think especially right now in this moment in the United States, it's really important to remember that like this idea of protecting women can also spur violence. So I'm a white woman from the American South, and I live every day with the fact that like there were lynchings and racial violence deployed throughout American history, oftentimes in the American South, to protect white women. And that there was terrible violence done in the names of protecting white women. And that's a sort of narrative that has replicated itself globally. The violence done to protect our women from their men. And so there's sort of this duality to the notion of protecting women.
Well, and I think that is a transition to one of the darker and more challenging questions that associates women in conflict, is that in so many conflict settings, the use of sexual violence has been weaponized. And this goes exactly to the question of what women are ostensibly being protected against. It intersects enormously with social norms and expectations and the way in which you dehumanize both the woman and the associated man by exerting sexual conquest over their partners. There's been a lot of research that looks into this issue, and I'm curious if you guys can share with us what the research says, both about what makes this more likely to occur and perhaps more optimistically and more hopefully what measures might be taken to mitigate the likelihood of its occurrence.
I want to start with the framing of sort of weapon of war, right? Because that is a popular framing. However, I find it not as helpful, and it's analytically not useful, because so much of what we know about sexual violence actually points to it not being ordered, right? And that it actually sort of emerges out of the social dynamics of the group, right? And so Dara K. Cohn's work in particular shows that groups and national militaries that rely on forced recruitment, so kidnapping, abductions, press ganging, the combatants in these groups lack social cohesion because they've been abducted, they've not volunteered, right? They don't have ties to each other, and as a result, they don't trust each other. But in order to be militarily effective, you need to have trust. You need to know that the person next to you will not run away when the first shot's fired. So sexual violence, wartime rape in particular, often emerges as a way to build these social ties, to build cohesion amongst the fighters who perpetrate sexual violence together. And sexual violence is so effective in doing that because it is a performance of masculinity, of brutality, of violence, as I mentioned earlier, in which women often participate as well, right? To prove their masculinity, to prove that they're belonging. And what connects to sort of the social dynamics of groups is the question of control and leadership. And there is some research that suggests that when principals have more control, so if commanders have more control, stronger control over their combatants, then they are better equipped to prevent sexual violence. For example, the Tamil Tigers were notorious for targeting civilians using terrorist tactics, but didn't perpetrate sexual violence on a massive scale. Maybe there were isolated incidents, but they had a very strict policy against that and had a very strict control within the group, as Libby Wood shows, that made sexual violence very rare. And so these are two of the sort of dynamics that are linked together, right? The social dynamics of the group and the leadership control. Hilary, take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, you did a great job and an awesome overview. And Rob's like way too humble to point out that he has worked very closely with Dara Cohen to help produce the sexual violence and armed conflict data set, which is sort of everyone's go-to measure for tracking which groups have perpetrated sexual violence when, in what forms. And one of the things that like their study revealed is that even though we often focus on non-state armed groups' perpetration of sexual violence and armed conflict, state militaries are actually the ones that are perpetrating it more often. And, you know, that's both terrible news, but also good news because there's a higher degree of influence that we can exert, right? Like it's very difficult to influence non-state armed groups' behavior, as opposed to state militaries, which ostensibly have domestic constituencies and potentially foreign military partners. And so in terms of, you know, what can be done to mitigate sexual violence and armed conflict, you know, if you want to get bang for your buck, I think we need to start focusing on state militaries and making it a bit of a priority in the international community. One of the few, I think, good news things I've ever shared on a podcast about my research is that, you know, recently the ICC has started to, has prosecuted forced marriage as a war crime. And that's worth noting, seeing whether or not higher levels of accountability in the international community can help prevent that sort of practice. Again, that was against a leader in a non-state armed group, so we'll see if that carries over to state militaries. But making this, you know, a matter of actual concern amongst the international community and foreign military partners might be an effective way of mitigating this. But yeah, Rob?
There's research that really shows that the international community is very responsive to reports of sexual violence, right? So Ismina Giselle's and Michelle Benson's work shows that the United Nations Security Council is more likely to address a conflict with a resolution if there are reports of sexual violence. There are two studies that show, including Karin Johansson and Lisa Holtman's work, that the UN is also more likely to send peacekeeping missions to conflicts when there are reports of sexual violence. And my own work that shows that governments are more likely to accept mediation offers and engage in mediation with rebel groups when the rebel groups are reported to perpetrate sexual violence. And all that kind of shows that, A, the governments and international system is responsive to sexual violence, and B, the reason that they are responsive is because they're gendered institutions, right? And our international system is gendered, and it's about the protection of women and children as sort of the vulnerable people worthy of protection.
You know, iconography plays such a powerful role in shaping the perception, the legitimacy, the public willingness to support rebel groups. And over the past several years, I think particularly of the Peshmerga as a group that has highlighted the role of women fighters. And I'm curious if you've seen changes in the research you've done or what influence you see from this increasing willingness to highlight the role of women as direct participants in conflict and combat, and whether that's what sort of influence is that having?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I don't think it's as novel as we like to think that it is. Meredith Loken's done a really incredible job documenting how rebel groups have used images of women and fighting women in order to cultivate support. And I think it's like part of a broader rebel public relations push, if we can call it that, to demonstrate, either the cause is so just that, women would take up arms or, so on or so forth. In the piece that Rob and I contributed to the roundtable, we discussed this SWAPO image, which is like a young smiling mother with a baby on her back and, a rifle in her arms. And that's, it's a really powerful image because it's evocative of what women's place in the political project is, both on the front lines with the rifle, but also not denying, her femininity with the baby. And so we've seen a lot of like leftist groups and some nationalist groups use that sort of imagery about, the kind of modern woman in the revolution. But I also want to point out that rebel groups that aren't incorporating women into frontline combat roles are still benefiting from the images of women that they're releasing, right? And so like the ISIS outreach to other women in which they're describing kind of, like a jihadi paradise with like the proper gender relations is also a part of a rebel PR strategy, and a gendered one, because it's laying out these like explicitly complementary roles for men and women. But a number of rebel groups, including ISIS, have, these magazines for women and these propaganda outlets aimed explicitly at women. And so I think rebel groups are kind of constantly putting out these gendered images, whether or not it's of women in the Peshmerga demonstrating, their relative liberalness and their gender progressivism in a neighborhood where that makes them potentially a very good ally for groups like the United States, or rebel groups putting out, a more conservative traditional gender relations. It just becomes another fault line by which rebel groups by which armed groups can differentiate themselves. And, these themes about how different non-state armed groups and the government themselves can all contest over, the role of women is something that Ora Sizekeli, whose last name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, has explored really beautifully in the context of the Syrian civil war. But there's a lot of really great research on this, particularly with regards to the Syrian civil war and the ways in which different relationships to gender norms and to women have acted as fault lines.
Just to reiterate what Hilary said in terms of the history, right? That we sometimes have like a goldfish memory, right? That the Peshmerga and their inclusion of women seems novel, but it really isn't. So Hilary's example of the SWAPO, right? That was in the 80s, but even 10, 15, well, now it's more like 20 years ago, the RUF in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, the armed groups included women, right? But they were treated differently by the media. And that's where another part comes in, which I think is important to recognize and discuss, is sort of the racial dynamics, right? That the women in the RAF in Sierra Leone or in Liberia were treated very differently, especially by the BBC and other Western media outlets, as sort of violent, but also sexualized, heavily sexualized women, while the Peshmerga are kind of shown in a more virtuous, righteous way. And recognizing these racial dynamics in addition to the gender dynamics is really important when we discuss women's participation in armed groups.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm curious as we wrap up, if there were one thing that you wanted a listener to take away about gender and conflict that may not be immediately obvious, what would it be? And we'll start with you, Rob, and then close with Hilary.
Gender is not an added thing. It is integral to everything that we do. And so therefore it's integral to conflict and violence and integral to institutions. It is both in terms of the nominal who is part of the institution. Is it men, women, who occupies positions of power? And then in terms of the substantive gendering, as I mentioned, what are the ideals, characteristics, and traits that are valued within an institution? Do they sort of fall into more traditional masculine sphere or in a more traditional feminine sphere, right? Are we valuing power over or power to? So the gendering of everything is what I want people to take away.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. You can take either one of ours away. That would be great. Rob's gives you a great start. But yeah, my one thing, I'm feeling a little bit spicy today. So I'll just say, ignoring gender and intersectionality doesn't make you impartial. It makes you bad at your job. And so I am persistently frustrated by often white, often male policymakers in the US government saying things like, well, I don't pay attention to race or gender. I just look for the best person for the job. And it's like, man, you are just like committed to replicating exclusionary and ineffective structures, literally to the detriment of our international security, as you pat yourself on the back for being impartial and objective. And so I would love if folks would just stop doing that, and more specifically, stop doing it around me, because I'm going to pull my hair out.
We've been talking with Dr. Robert Nagel and with soon-to-be Dr. Hilary Matfess. If she's not a doctor by the time you started the podcast, she may be by the time you finish. When is the defense date?
We don't actually have a defense, so I just get an email with a yes or no at some point.
Oh my God, that's nerve-wracking. Holy cow.
You're telling me.
Well, this has been a really enjoyable and insightful conversation. It's one that we could easily sustain for another hour, but I really appreciate you guys taking the time and doing this. And I would commend to our listeners to review the TNSR Roundtable from October. It's got a lot of fascinating, including the contribution by Hilary and Rob, but also a number of other really interesting essays on the topic. And thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.